Vocational education in Brazil, even though it's been postponed by the pandemic, is a very important issue now because of the secondary school reform, which attempts, first of all, there are lots of parts to that reform, but the two main parts are, first of all, to reduce the number of required courses. In other words, I believe that until now, a student had to take in the 3 years of high school, had to take 12 courses each year. And it was a phenomenal list of courses that they had to take. And the attempt was to reduce that number of courses somewhat. The other, we're not going to talk about that. There have been other things going on, like moving to whole day schools in some states. And that's generally a movement that's going out throughout Brazil. That's not only taking place at the secondary level, but it's mainly taking place at the secondary level. And the third thing is the vocational education. So right now, there is vocational education in Brazil. And whenever you say to somebody, oh, vocational education, they say, oh, yes, there are these very elite vocational education schools in Brazil. And that's considered a very elite topic, and elite schools, and the people end up going to generally technical university education, such as engineering or some other technical field. Also, in the full day schools, at least the ones we looked at in Pernambuco, the best of those schools tend to have a kind of vocational orientation. In other words, they, in addition to their regular curriculum, they tend to emphasize some sort of vocational skills along with that. And those schools turn out to be somewhat selective, and at least they started that way. So when you discuss vocational education with the Brazilian reformers, that's sort of the model that they have in mind, of a rather high-end student going to vocational education. But the way the reform is posed, that probably is not the way that it's going to turn out, because as it expands, it's probably going to lose that flavor to vocational education. So what I want to talk to you about today is sort of different models of vocational education, what we know about them in terms of outcomes for the students, and then what is likely to be the case in Brazil. Let me just mention before I go on that there is a very, very good vocational training programs, two of them, SENAC and SENAI, in Brazil, which have been going on for decades. They're very well known, and they're considered very good. However, they are for people who are already employed, and they are basically financed by the companies who subscribe to SENAC and SENAI, and they're run out of different ministries, these training programs, but they are organized to enhance the skills of workers who are already working for some company, and then will go back and either get promoted or work at a higher level in that job. So that should not be confused with secondary vocational education, which is for students who are not employed. So what are the arguments for vocational education? The main arguments are, first of all, There's a very famous piece by Philip Foster back in the early 60s that argued pretty persuasively that really all education, and he was talking pretty much about secondary and up, all education is vocational. It just depends for which vocation. So there's now in human capital theory, there's some discussion about that, whether secondary education is really vocational or not, or whether it's simply preparing you to academically so that you can have a better choice or of education at the university level, which is more vocational. But his argument was that it's all vocational, and it's all designed in some part or other to train you for the labor market. So the argument for vocational education, the way we think about it, which is sort of non-academic or less academic and more practical education, is that many students simply aren't interested or very good at academic subjects. So that by adolescence, they prefer to drop out of school rather than continue to suffer in classes which they simply don't like, can't engage with, etc. It's also argued that you really need many technical trained workers that do not require university education. And it would be very good for the economy to train students in school to be better prepared to either take those jobs or be trained for those jobs, more specifically. And the third argument is that you might be able to use a more practical approach to schooling based on things that kids would like to learn, to teach them also skills, more academic skills that are necessary to graduate, and then perhaps even go on once they get engaged in these academic learning processes, to go on and get higher education, more sophisticated skills. So the three main arguments are that well, there are really two main arguments. One is that you want to keep students in school. And the second argument, and so vocational education might be more likely to engage them to stay in school. The second argument is that you want to prepare them for jobs which don't require university education. And those jobs there are lots of demand for those kind of skills. And thirdly, that you might be able to engage some students to be actually better prepared academically by using practical training to engage them. So how do can I shift to the next slide? Okay, so here are the downsides. So those students that fall into disengaged or not academically oriented categories are much more likely to come from lower than from higher SES families. So there's a very high correlation between socioeconomic background and how well kids do in school academically. So it is likely that the kind of kids that we're talking about are from lower social class families. So even there are a lot of academically able kids who are lower social class students. But if there's a vocational school option, a lot of these families and school personnel are going to see these kids, even if they're more able, to be, or that they should be sort of pushed toward vocational education and vocational education type careers. And you see a lot of that. I don't know, I think I'm going to talk about Chile later on. In Chile, there are about 40 to 50% of students go to vocational secondary schools, separate schools. There are elite vocational schools in Chile, and those are attended by select students who are in the upper 15% of the academic ability distribution. However, because they have to take so many vocational courses in the last 2 years of secondary school, they're much less likely to be prepared for the university entrance test, and are much less likely to go to university, even though they want to go to university. So if those kind of kids are pushed into vocational schools, where there's a good chance that you sort of lose that upper tier of lower social class kids, because they're more likely to go into vocational education, and therefore they're sort of cut off from going to university, even though they're perfectly capable of going to university. So this likelihood that lower social class kids are ending up in vocational education, it makes vocational education, it becomes associated as second-class education. Okay, it's not for smart elite kids. The other downside is that vocational education is more expensive than academic education because you need equipment, et cetera. Of course, you can get away on the cheap in vocational education by using secondhand equipment and old equipment, et cetera. And most vocational schools do that. But the problem with that is that this argument that you're going to be training kids in technical skills, that you lose that argument because you're using equipment which doesn't train them on the latest equipment, and therefore they're not prepared to take the kind of jobs that are available. An auto mechanic is a very, very good example. Unless you have the latest technology in repairing automobiles, including all the electronics on automobiles, if you don't have that, you can't train to be an auto mechanic. You can train to be an auto mechanic, but you're not prepared to take a job as an auto mechanic. Okay, I don't. Okay, so let me give you two models here very quickly about vocational education. There are actually, I'll say there are three models. The German model is the one a lot of people talk about, and that is being talked about in Brazil as well, and it's been talked about in the past in the US. Back in the 90s, they were talking about importing the German model. What is the German model? Well, that model in general is that you go to a separate education system when you take vocational education. It's not in the same schools as the academic education. It's in separate vocational schools. Now, that's the general idea, separate schools. The dual system version of that is very work-oriented. And that's used, the most pure example is Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, but it comes in modified forms in Denmark, Holland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, pretty much through Eastern Europe. So it combines vocational and academic education with apprenticeships in firms. Now, in the pure model, the dual system model, the firm pays the student a low salary for several years while providing work experience. And then the student is certified as skilled in a particular trade and tries to get work in that trade. Even if they don't get work in that trade, they might end up in another trade. But the fact is that they have worked for 3 years in a work situation, which, by the way, is very, very valuable experience. It's one of the big conditions of getting a job is that you've had a job. And that's considered important by employers. So the idea of, in this model, the kids go to school 2 or 3 days a week in a formal schooling, and they work the rest of the time. The dual system in this pure form really depends on having formal relationships and trust between the state, which is the provider of the vocational education, and the certifier of the skills, between the state, private industry, which agrees to hire these students and give them training, and the labor unions, which agree to allow apprentices to work for much lower salary than regular employees. It's generally agreed that after about a year as an apprentice, the productivity in most jobs in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, the productivity of these students is actually about as high as of the workers, but they're only getting paid a third of the salary. So this is a great deal for the companies. They get 2 years of work from students paid at a third of the salary and pretty much the same productivity. The unions have to agree to this because it means that you're basically using students for a lot of the jobs instead of regular employees. And the state has to be involved because it has to coordinate the apprenticeships with the regular school. So that requires a kind of a government, it requires a relationship in the civil society, between the civil society and the government, which is pretty hard to duplicate in most countries, to have this kind of relationship between unions, the government, and private industry. Okay, next slide. So it's other countries have the separate schools with less of a work orientation, and the programs don't work quite as well as in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, but there are also people make that choice for vocational versus academic track, or they're chosen for the different tracks. In most places, after the 9th grade, but in some countries, even after the 8th grade. So it's pretty early the kids are 13 or 14 years old when they do this. The other end of the spectrum, there are some countries that don't have a separate vocational education that parallels academic education. And vocational education is actually a separate track within comprehensive secondary schools. In this case, in the US, this kind of education has actually declined over time as university education becomes much more accessible for most students, and a very high percentage of students ends up going to university. So vocational education becomes much less popular. And there's also been another kind of shift from vocational education, what's called career technical education in some US high schools. We can talk about that more. That's a way to prepare students for post-secondary education and careers at the same time. In other words, it's much more stress on academics, much more stress on engaging the students through practical work, and less stress on actually training them for a particular vocation. So they take a number of practical courses, but they still fulfill the college entrance course requirements. So this supposedly contributes to students' job readiness while also motivating them to complete secondary school and go to college. And the programs have been relatively successful in this career technical education. But most US high schools don't have such programs. They have a vocational track. And if you take the vocational track and you take a number of vocational courses, you are much less likely to be able to complete the minimum requirements to go to a 4-year university. So there is a trade-off. You can't do both in most cases. Okay, so we go on next slide. Okay, so as I said, the German model is really rooted in this neo-corporatist framework of Central and Northern European society. And it's also consistent with Soviet centralized planning in which students can be prepared for jobs and guaranteed to get those jobs. So that was the case in the Soviet Union and in the former communist countries in Eastern Europe and in China as well. This idea of a vocational school, which prepares people for jobs in basically government-run companies. So the other thing is that the German model requires decisions by students at an early age in choosing lifetime careers. Now, they don't always get the careers that they choose, but basically they're going to choose to work in a more of a, I would say, a working class job, a technical job, or even become a baker or a cook. In some countries, we even train to be a waiter. For example, in Italy and France, there are schools for not only for cooks, they're all in the same school. I've gone to lunch at a bunch of those schools in Italy. Where actually students are training to be waiters in restaurants as a lifetime career. Okay, this is unheard of in the United States. So the U.S. model, that model is much more risk averse. It means that individuals count on lifetime jobs, the employees are protected by tight regulations, and the unions are powerful actors in the state economic decision-making. The US model is much more risk-preferring, both on the part of employers, with much greater flexibility in hiring and firing workers. So if they try you out, you don't work out, you're fired. It's very hard in Europe to do that. Once you're employed for more than 3 months in a European firm, you're basically semi-permanently employed. The employer makes a decision at the end of 3 months, am I going to keep this person or not? But in a US company, you can work for a year or two and you may not work out and you're let go. So in the current labor market, by the way, people just read that 5.4 million people last month changed jobs, a record in the US labor market. So people can also decide to leave and change jobs. Students take a lot of risk because they're not really trained for anything specific. So they're not, when they go out into the labor market, even with a vocational training job, they're probably likely not to get the job that they're trained for. And the real question is, will they fit in to the whatever work they're doing, or not? So it's very risk oriented because they haven't really been trained on the job. So students don't have to choose careers early in the U.S. A typical person in the U.S. before, it used to be before age 25, but now it's before age 35. It's something like a person will have 10 different jobs before age 35 in the US now. Tremendous turnover in jobs. So it's a very flexible kind of situation. Also, you might be more flexible in going back to school. Very hard to do in most societies. Most societies, once you're 25, 26 years old, you can't decide to go to university at that age or to change professions and go to university. But in the US, you can do that. So it requires a lot of risk taking in that kind of situation. The risk is minimized in the dual system. People choose early. They basically choose their slot in society, and this is what they do for the rest of their lives. Okay. Okay. So, as I said, most countries prepare people in separate schools, and it's 8th or 9th grade decision. In Latin America, Chile, and Mexico, track a lot of lower social class students in vocational secondary schools. About 10% of vet students, as I told you, in Chile, attend select vet schools, and yet, and they end up doing much lower on the university entrance exam, and so are less likely to enter university. So by entering vocational schools so early, people's educational opportunities are really defined before they're able to show academic or vocational talents that would alter their educational work careers. Pretty early, 13 or 14 years old, and particularly when people nowadays are living into their 80s quite regularly and working into their 60s and 70s. To choose your track by 13 or 14 seems a little bit strange. Next slide. So there have been a number of studies that assess whether vet is more or less successful in traditional academic schooling and producing achievement gains for similar kind of students. So what we're really trying to do here is compare similar students. And this is the real difficulty of making these comparisons, because it's likely in most cases that students are very dissimilar who do the vocational education and who do the academic education. But in many countries, there's some overlap. Like in the case of Chile, you got these 10% of vocational students who are basically could have gone to academic schools, but didn't. So we can do a comparison of those. There are other countries like Austria, where, by the way, a rather high fraction of, a reasonably high fraction of vocational students actually come from middle and higher social class backgrounds. So we can get overlap and try to in some way or other compare similar students and see similar ability, social class, to sort of simulate a random assignment in the two tracks. So Hanishek and Wussman in 2006 and Jakubowski in 2010 used difference in differences approach, which is, by the way, not, it is a kind of causal approach, but is not so much of a simulated random assignment. But they use this to apply to fourth grade Tim's 2003, Pearl's 2001 data, and 15-year-old performance on PISA in 2000 and 2003 across countries, testing whether countries that separate students into vet and academic track before 15-year-olds have higher or lower gains between their students' primary school performance and in the different tracks and secondary school performance. By the way, I've left out some. They use difference opposed to fourth grade Tim's 2003 and later eighth grade data, and Pearl's 2001 as a control for 15-year-olds on a PISA 2000-2003 across countries. They're not using individuals, they're using country averages in this case. Okay, so they claimed, Hanishek and Wussman claimed, that there was no gains in mean performance from tracking, and that tracking increased the inequality of educational outcomes. So they were testing whether the countries that track students into vocational tracks, into vocational schools, did better or worse overall gains in test scores, whether those countries did better than countries that didn't track into separate schools. What they found is that there was no difference between these different kind of countries. And they also found, however, that if you look at the test scores on the PISA and on the TIMSS eighth grade, that those students that tracked in those students that were in countries that tracked, they had much more unequal outcomes than the students on that didn't track. Yukubovsky confirmed that there was a negative correlation between tracking and mean performance at the secondary level, controlling for earlier performance. Yet he found that this negative effect came mainly from a group of countries in Eastern Europe, and that there was no evidence of negative effect in other countries. So what these two studies did was they controlled at the country level for earlier gains and for social class of the students. But they didn't actually control on the same students at different points in their academic career. Next slide, please. So there is a group of studies that actually looks at the same students as they progress through the system who were in the vocational track versus the academic track, and tries to compare similar students using, in one case, in a couple of cases, using propensity score matching. And then we did a sort of fuzzy regression discontinuity for 3 countries in Europe. So let's talk about this Faria study for a second, because it was quite a good study. It was done here as a dissertation at Stanford. And what he did was he looked at students' test scores on the 8th grade, 10th grade SIMSA test, which is a national test, and the college entrance test, which is given in the 12th grade. And he tracked these students and found that by the end of the 12th grade, the average gap. So what he did was he used the propensity score matching to sort of reduce his sample, reduce the population down to those students who were in a range, who had a similar likelihood of attending based on their social class and their 8th grade test scores, had a similar likelihood of attending vocational schools or academic schools. So we excluded the students who are very unlikely to go to academic schools, and those students who are very unlikely to go to vocational schools. So he got this group of students who are similarly likely to go to the 2 kinds of schools. He said, okay, let's follow them and see what the gains were on these screens. And what he found was that the average gap on the university test is significantly negative for those students who attended vet schools. In other words, vet schools had a negative effect on students' university entrance test score compared to going to an academic school. And the higher the student's 8th grade test score, which is what you would predict, by the way, the higher the student's 8th grade test score, the larger the gap is. And for lower scoring students, the gap is actually not significant. So for lower scoring students, it didn't make much difference whether for 8th grade, whether you attended a vet school or not, in terms of how you would do it on the college entrance test. But if you were one of these very high scoring students and you ended up in a vet school, you were very negatively affected by that in terms of going to the university. We observed this, by the way, when we visited such schools in Chile in 2003. The principals complained that these students wanted to go to university, but because they had spent in the 11th and 12th grade much less time studying mathematics and Portuguese, which were the heavily tested subjects on the entrance test to university, they did worse than they should have done if they had gone to an academic school. This was told by the principal of the vocational school. So the other point is that similar students enrolled in vet school were much less likely to enroll in bachelor's degree higher education. And again, this gap increased with the student's 8th grade score. So providing the vocational education on a broad scale, which is what happens in Chile, sucks in a group of students who actually would have been better off going to academic schools. But because they come from a lower social class background, even though they might be high ability students, and because their peers in their schools are all going to vet schools, all of a sudden they get to go to these elite vet schools, selective vet schools, and as a result, they get penalized to go to university, which is where they should be going. Next slide. There are two other studies that I want to just tell you about, and then I'll finish up. Our own Prashant Loyalka do a large sample of vocational schools in China that offer computer major and a large sample of non-elite academic high schools, which all teach some computer skills in 2 Chinese provinces, and a total of 7 prefectures within these 2 provinces. So their outcome variables were whether the student dropped out in that period and the gains during an academic year. So they tested the kids in the beginning and tested the kids at the end of the year on math, general math skills, and computer skills. And they use an instrumental variables approach and what they call the Corson exact matching approach analysis, which is similar to propensity score matching. In other words, to reduce the sample to those people who are within a range similarly likely to go to vocational schools and academic schools, but one group chose to go to vocational and the other to academic. So the results of these 2 approaches show that the vet students in China are somewhat more likely to drop out, that vet students decline in math skills relative to academic high school students by statistically significant 3 to 4 tenths of a standard deviation, and that the vet students did not make significantly different gains in computer skills, which they were supposed to. These were vet programs that were specializing in computer skills. And the kids in the academic high schools actually got as big a gains in computer skills as the kids in the vet schools. So this is a disaster situation, because we're talking about, in China, more than 40% of students attend vocational ed. Only 55 to 60% go to academic high school. So for low ability students, in this case, it's the opposite of Chile. For low ability students, the outcomes are even worse on all 3 outcomes if they attend a vocational school than for average ability students. Next slide, please. So the last one I want to tell you about is a study we did in Europe for 3 countries. The 3 countries are Austria, Croatia, and Hungary. And they all have similar programs. The tracking starts early, after 8th grade. And this is important for us because what we could do in this case, since PISA test kids who are in these countries are all in the 9th and 10th grades. So we had a group of students who were tested in the 9th grade, a group of students tested in the 10th grade, and it's largely because of when they enter primary school. So we had the birth dates on these kids, and we used a PISA, I don't remember what year PISA 2012 to do this. And so we faced, this is the problem. The problem, you're in 8th grade, you choose to go to vocational school or go to academic school. So the issue is, how can you get a group of kids, how can you control for the fact that these kids might be very different from each other? So what we did was we said, okay, let's just compare the kids within vocational school who were, by dint of their birth date, because these are countries that are pretty tough on enforcing when you can enter first grade on your birthday. So they're pretty tough on enforcing this. So we have people in the 9th grade and 10th grade who are almost randomly assigned because it just happens that they're in the 9th and the 10th grade because of their birthday, no other reason. So we take kids on either side of the birthday break line and compare them within the vocational schools and within the academic schools. And we try to see what the gains in test scores are for those kids between 9th grade and 10th grade. Okay, so we have the 10th grade, we have students in 10th grade who've now been in 9th and 10th grade. And we have students in 9th grade who've only been in 9th grade. And so we see what the gain in the scores is. And these students should be very similar because the only thing that kind of separates them is their birth date. Okay? We also control for the social class, et cetera, just to make sure. But the fact is that we have pretty good, it's fuzzy, but it's a pretty good break in this regression discontinuity. We call it, it's a kind of instrumental variables approach. So we compare the students on either side of the cutoff, the vocational track and the general track. And our results are pretty interesting. In only one country do the IV results, this method that we use, show consistently higher test score gains in the general track, the academic track, than in the vocational track. And the other two countries, the differences were not significant. In other words, even though the vocational schools started with lower test scores, on average, they have lower test scores at both the 9th and 10th grade level, the gains in the vocational track in Croatia and Hungary were pretty much the same as in the academic track on the PISA test. In Austria, not true. But in Austria, the kids in a vocational track are spending much more time working than in the other two countries. So that might be the explanation, not the fact that they're in a vocational track. All right, so they spend less time on academic subjects altogether. And remember, these are the first 2 years of the program. If we did this between 9th grade and 12th grade, if we could have done that, we might have found what Farias found, that in fact, by 12th grade, the gains are much smaller because as you move along, you spend much less time doing academic subjects and much more time doing vocational subjects. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly say that we had another Stanford student, Mielewski, my Polish compatriot. She and I, she actually did speak Polish still. So she was a very good student. I don't know if Eric remembers her, but what she did was she looked at course by course tracking in US schools versus tracking across countries where kids are tracked into actually different schools and rather than different courses. And what she found was that the math achievement gaps between the tracks did not differ dramatically, except between the lower and middle tracks in these course by course tracking, where the gap is larger for vocational students. So this is sort of she found bigger gaps among lower ability students. She didn't find really any big differences between the two kinds of tracking, except for the fact that the US style course by course tracking is less social class segregated than tracking where students attend different schools. All right, next slide, please. I forgot how long this is, so all right. I did want to make one other cases about what happens in labor market outcomes, which is pretty interesting because a lot of research has been done on this, and there's some pretty good research. Again, Hanashek et al. In a very recent paper, 2017, they found that, in fact, the claims that vocational skills enhance relatively short-term employment earnings and that general skills enhance relatively long-term employment earnings, they found that's true across countries. They found that vocational education graduates had higher employment rates and earnings at earlier ages, and the advantage disappeared and turned negative as individuals reach middle age. And this is did Brunello and Rocco in 2015 use PIAC. PIAC is the adult survey of the OECD. And they used propensity score matching again, and found that for males with completed secondary education, there was no significant difference in earnings, and that for females, those who attended academic schooling earn about 4 to 5% more. And the differences were much larger at the post-secondary level. But I think the important point is that these studies suggest that early on, for a few years in their 20s, the vocational school graduates have a bit of an advantage, both in employment and earnings. But as time goes on, this advantage disappears. And in fact, the people who learn general skills do much better in the long run than the vocational education graduates. Next slide, please. Okay, so vet students tend to be more male, lower SES, have lower academic achievement levels, and there's mixed evidence whether such lower achievement students benefit from higher academic gains when they attend vet schools or tracks. But there is evidence that higher achieving students in vet schools may suffer from lower gains and reduced access. Attending vet schools does provide higher levels of employment earnings in the short run, but has negative effects on both in the long run. And if vet secondary education, if the advantage goes away if that secondary education reduces probability of going on to higher education. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does this mean for Brazil? So our analysis suggests that career technical education, which focuses more on academic than typical vocational education within comprehensive high schools, may be a good option for the Brazilian context, mainly because Brazil does not have the proper governance political structure to implement a dual system model or anything like it, a separate school model. And because it would end up assigning many academically talented low-income Brazilians, young Brazilians, to vocational schools and factory jobs, which would exacerbate already high income inequality. So the CTE model would have the advantage. And I think in most, this is really up to the states, because the states are in charge of secondary education. So there could be some states that choose separate vocational schools, but it's much more likely that most states will choose to have the vocational track within the comprehensive high schools, US style. If they use the CTE model, that would, given the Brazilian situation and the fact that the Brazilian labor market is very risky for both, it isn't organized like a Central European labor market. So it's more like a US labor market, that it would give options, more options for less academically inclined young Brazilians for careers that might, let them complete their academic requirements for university, for example, or they may choose to work immediately or take the NM and go on to university, even in the vocational track. And I think it would reduce the Chilean and Mexican problem. The Chilean and Mexican problem is that in 9th grade, people are slotted into vocational schools and into academic schools, and you're losing a bunch of young people that shouldn't have gone to those vocational schools. So I'll leave it at that. I think that the vocational education discussion is going to go on for several years as states decide what to do. So perhaps all of you, as future policymakers in Brazil, can have some impact on this. I hope I've given you some framework in which to think about these issues.
Well, since you can't thank yourself, Martin, I'll thank you on behalf of the seminar. So thanks very much for an interesting presentation. And Marcelo, you want to make a comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Martin. Nice to meet you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Happy New Year. Well, I am now in the United States. I maybe chose the worst period to be here because of the pandemic. I'm in Boston. Also, now it's 23 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's a little bit cold. So anyway, let me just comment, Martin, that there is a very interesting example that we have at the University of Campinas, Unicamp. We have two technical schools, what we call technical schools. There are vocational education, and in fact, they are among the best in Brazil. And what happened is that the model is it's completely for free, as they are public high schools, and the students go in the morning for a comprehensive normal high school, and in the afternoon they attend the technical part of the program. And in fact, what happens is that I would say 90% of them or 95% of them are able to get into a public university. They perform very well in the vestibular. And in fact, we have another problem that you didn't mention, because the education is so good and so interesting, and have a very good impact in work. We have we need to have a vestibulinho that we call. It's a kind of entrance exam before going to this school, and it's so hard to get in. There are programs, for example, in computer science. It's about nowadays 35 or 40 students per spot that try to get in. So it's very hard for a student that is still maybe 13, 14 years old. It's a very complicated system, and we are facing a big issue regarding this entrance exam, and to avoid to become an elite school instead of having a more representative group of people. But in fact, it works very well. I have the experience, just to mention, my son went to this school, and just after finishing, they need to make a stage, and in fact, there are the companies go there and try to attract these students as much as possible. So it's really very interesting and very successful. I would recommend maybe to take a look on these examples that are very interesting in Brazil already happening. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Marcelo, do you think that this can be duplicated on a large scale in Brazil?
It could. The problem, as I mentioned, it's more expensive than a normal high school. They need to have more laboratories and better professors. But I would say that the main thing that you already know, it's a good practice, good direction, good quality of the faculty, and this is happening. There are some spots of these high quality programs around Brazil that I know few, and they could be eventually replicated in many places, in my personal opinion, at least.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Martin, thanks for your presentation, as always. I'm wondering how you would think about the model, the neo-corporatist model, if it had one change, that was the secondary schools were private rather than state-run. Given what's happened in higher education, as I understand it, in Brazil, not so much in secondary education, but it seems to me at least somebody in the Brazilian context may be arguing for private secondary schools, maybe both academic and the vocational. How would you respond to people who might suggest that?
Private secondary schools are very common in Brazil. In fact, there was a time before the great expansion of secondary education in the 90s, that a very high percentage of secondary schools were private in Brazil. Private secondary education is still an important feature of Brazilian education. I would say in large cities, I wouldn't be surprised if 20 to 30% of the students minimum go to private secondary schools. Maybe some of the Brazilians want to say something about that.
Both academic and vocational?
No, not. Yeah, but
academic.
the kind of schools that Marcelo are talking about are few and far between.
Right.
There are such schools in many states, by the way. These kind of elite technical schools. I mentioned them at the beginning of the talk.
Right.
He's right. It would be possible to do this on a large scale at very great expense. You would have to find the teaching pool that would be able to do that. I think somebody raised the question on chat about whether the university teachers, whether teachers from the university, is it you, Francisco, who asked that? Whether teachers from the university participate in this school, in these schools. So, I mean, the problem with any great high quality model is scaling it up. And you got to figure out how you're going to scale it up. If you just start a vocational, if you say, okay, we're going to start a vocational education track in Pernambuco, in all the schools. So the question is, what is that going to turn out to be? Is it going to turn out to be what Marcelo is talking about? And there are other examples of what he's talking about. Or is it going to turn out to be a vocational track with low, crappy equipment and a lot of courses for lower social class kids that just occupy their time and just sort of, and listen, I did a study back in the 90s of CONALEP in Mexico, a very big system of vocational education. And it is a holding tank for lower social class kids, high dropout, and it's the bottom of the barrel. So it could be that too. Much cheaper than what Marcelo's talking about. But so if you can, all I want to say is that this discussion that we're having here is very important, because if I would suggest that Marcelo fight hard for the kind of vocational education that he's talking about, to make that the standard. Everybody has to do that, or you can't do it. Not allowed to do it unless it's going to be like that. I would expand that, figure out how to expand that, because otherwise the default is throw the lower social class kids into vocational education. Okay, that's the typical story around the world. Typical story. Not everybody, but a high percentage of kids fit that category.
Okay, Francisco.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to add like another layer of problems to this, and also hear Cornell's opinion and Plank's opinion. But a lot of systems in Brazil, they have the perception that vocational education actually supports students to do better academically. But they also previously, before the reform, students would also spend a lot more time in school if they choose to do vocational education tracks. Because they would spend at least another 800 hours, which is like at least a third of the hours they spent in high school to get the additional degree in comparison to all other students. And now they're actually using the same amount of time. They're going to spend the same amount of time in school. So all students are going to spend 3,000 hours. And actually for vocational education students, that's going to be less than they expend in school previously. So I think it's going to be curious to see how that difference in time plays out, because you're kind of averaging the amount of hours all students are going to spend in classroom. And I think some of those gains that we are seeing in some systems might be negligible at that point. So I don't know. I think some of you that are more willing to tackle like quantitative work might find ways to prove this or disprove this. But I think this is going to be very challenging because the students they're not going to have any benefits academically from spending more hours in vocational education. In contrast to kids who are actually doing strictly academic tracks to get into college, for instance.
Gabriela has a similar question about Chile related to what you just said, in which he said that maybe the higher grades in eighth grade in vocational courses is not relevant. Gabriela, the vocational school in Chile doesn't start till the ninth grade. So they make the choice in eighth grade. They all go to the same basic education in Chile. It varies a lot in quality, but so the eighth grade scores are for people who have taken only academic education. It would be similar in Brazil, but ninth grade. In other words, there is no vocational track in Brazil before the ninth grade. So in the Chilean case, it only applies to ninth to 12th grade. And it is true that in the ninth and 10th grade in Chile, the academic schools and the vocational schools have the same curriculum. They don't do vocational courses until the 11th and 12th grade. And it is in the 11th and 12th grade that these students begin to lose out on their academic scores. It's between the 10th and the 12th grade, not between the 8th and the 10th grade. He finds no difference between the gains in 8th and 10th grade in the two kinds of schools. So Francisco's point is correct. The more time you spend on vocational courses and time doing vocational stuff, it's going to hurt you academically if you're not doing the same number of hours on the things that are tested on the college entrance test. Now, for people who are not going to go to university, they might be better off in a vocational track. That's what Farias found. At the low end of ability, there was no difference in gains. But for the kids who are at the top, now, if you have the kind of elite selective schools that Marcelo's talking about, then vocational education probably enhances the experience of those kids because it's organized pretty much academically for them. And the vocational stuff is an add-on that sort of gives them even more experience in doing stuff. So it makes them even more attractive than they would be otherwise. Is that right, Marcelo?
Yes, I agree.
Eric?
So I was just going to chime in. I should share with you kind of the latest version of our work in Colombia, because I mean, in Colombia, when we go back to that voucher program, students had to apply to the school before they could even apply for the voucher. And so we had a set of students who applied to vocational schools that then had the respective lotteries at their schools. And some of them basically lost that lottery, didn't receive the voucher. And so they ended up mostly transferring to academic schools. And so we have a kind of a nice comparison, at least for amongst private vocational schools, high schools, where we have lottery based. And what's nice about it is because we had 150 vocational schools, we have a great sample of schools where we can look at characteristics of the schools that seem to be driving the effects. So in our case, we're actually finding that there's academic advantages, higher likelihood of going to higher education if they were in a vocational school. We're also finding that earnings, at age 33 are higher, not just in the short run, but we actually get something, 15 years out. But the other piece that we're finding that's kind of fun and interesting that it kind of to add to the discussion is because we observed characteristics of the curriculum, one of the things that's kind of unique is the vocational schools that are private are much more sensitive to the demands of the job market, and they're changing their curriculum and creating better links that students are exploiting. And when we look at the students who weren't going to those type of private vocational schools, there was a very stale curriculum. It wasn't changing or evolving as the Colombian economy was evolving. And in this particular case, almost the entire effect that we observe in terms of better earnings and better academic outcomes, better access to higher education, was coming through that kind of tight connection and sensitivity to where the labor market was going. So there's an element here where that private sector, or for whatever reason, that nimbleness to kind of stay connected to the current market really can actually be kind of an intervening force here in this discussion.
Okay, Anna.
Hi, everyone.
Anna.
So, hi. I would just like to contribute to the discussion because I'm working on a paper on vocational education with Francisco and Professor Plank, and we've interviewed 12 states, the leaders of vocational education in the states. And pretty much like the majority of them, they have a common vision, like Professor Carnoy presented to us, that vocational education is not an end in itself, but should be the first step for a career. And that includes preparing students to higher education, to entrepreneurship, and also to the job market. But they don't have this vision though, that vocational education should prepare students just to have the first job and have like an income source as fast as they can, but thinking about the long term. So in terms of the vision, the data we collected show that there is this vision that providing students more opportunities, but they have a challenge to implement this vision with the budget they have, the resources, and all the extra work that they should do to hire teachers for vocational education, to prepare the teachers, to have the labs, all the infrastructure. So I think listening to the states and how they are preparing for this new high school system in Brazil and the plans that they have for vocational education, we have this idea that the vision is aligned, but the challenges is more related with the implementation and the conditions that they have to implement this vision of vocational education as an opportunity and not just something that is focused on the short term. So maybe just like one comment to add on the discussion and how we can implement the vision and what the states told us about how they face vocational education.
Yeah, just to amplify Anna's point, I mean, so much of this, Martin, has to do with the implementation of the programs. I mean, there are huge issues around costs. There are issues around who's teaching in these programs, what their background is, what their goals are. So there's a lot sort of beneath the surface in terms of policy design and policy implementation that certainly affects the general results across programs and across countries.
Are you seeing variation across the states? Anna suggested that there seemed to be a common vision of the people across the states.
most part of them, they have the visual of the CTE. So like vocational education preparing students not only for the job market, but also for higher education. And the best example I can use is Paraíba, because the curriculum for vocational education, they have the same amount of hours dedicated to the job market, entrepreneurship, and higher education, preparing to higher education. So they already divide the curriculum, giving emphasis to these three areas and not just job market, as we would expect from a vocational education track. So maybe like is one example in state first to analyze in deep, because I believe that they are implementing this CTE in their curriculum. So, but the challenge is not the vision and what they want to do, but the resources and conditions to do so in a way that provide opportunities for all the students.
The real question is, are they going to get less math and Portuguese? Are they going to get less of the tested subjects on the NA? I think that's really the issue. Plain and simple, just to put it bluntly. If Francisco says that the people are taking these extra hours, but the extra hours are added on to these academic subjects, that's one thing. But it's unlikely that that's going to happen. So the other question I want to ask you is, are they foreseeing this to be all within comprehensive high schools? So in other words, are these separate schools or are they comprehensive schools?
Most of the states, they want to partner with universities and industries and other institutions like SESI, SENAI that are already operating in the state and have the infrastructure to provide the labs and the practical training. So they don't have the resources to do it in the schools, but they want to do these partnerships with these institutions.
But it will be comprehensive schools will have partnerships with these other programs.
Partnerships.
Because the students will be in the same high schools as other students, but they'll just take these courses. Basically, they'll take courses at these other institutions.
Yes, they want.
Can I compliment, Anna?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you can compliment.
Martin. So it states that the kind of provision is going to differ significantly across states. So you have states like São Paulo and Acre, for instance, that they have an institution that provides vocational education. So in Acre, you have a foundation. In São Paulo, you have Santo Paulo Souza, and they are the ones providing vocational education for students. And then you have cases like Minas Gerais, for instance, where provision is going to be done by a partner. Like Senac is the one offering vocational education for high school students in public schools in Minas Gerais.
So, but what?
And then you have
the question I want to ask.
You have states that actually took on the provision.
But the question I want to ask is, I'm a student. I attend a state high school, and then I take courses at these other institutions. Is that the deal?
No. For the new high school, if you are a high school student and you choose the vocational track, when you have lab class, you are going to Senai or SESI, the partner institution.
Oh, so you're not going to be in the same school as the other students, as the academic students.
Depends on the state.
Depends on the state.
But in some states, it's going to be separate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kiss that one goodbye. So Senai is going to be in charge of providing academic education, academically oriented education for these vocational students in some places.
I think Senai is with someone. Do you remember one? Because I know Senai.
Yeah, I understand. Senai or Senaki. It doesn't matter. But it's going to be a vocation. It's going to be a vocational.
They're not going to provide academic course, the 800 hours.
They are going to provide academic courses.
Yeah, they're going to provide like 1,200 hours, and then the states are going to provide the other 800 hours, basically.
Oh, I see. But where are the students going to take the academic courses?
In their high school of choice.
So that's what I'm trying to say. If I'm a student, am I going to attend a public high school with academic students for part of my time? In every case. And then I'm going to go off and do my vocational education at some other place.
In some states, you're going to go somewhere else. In some states, you're going to do in the same school.
Yeah. So in other words, whoever's going to provide the vocational education is going to come into the school to set up that vocational education.
Yeah.
In some cases. Got it. But in order to do that, the students who are in a vocational track are going to have to take less academic courses. True?
Yes. So students,
The day is only so long.
yeah. So students have $1,800 that are like everyone has to take, and then they have $1,200 that they're going to choose one of the 5 pathways, and then they're going to have classes on that pathway.
Okay. So the students who do the vocational track are going to have
So if you
1,200
choose a
hours,
vocational, yeah,
1,200
they're gonna
hours in
be-
vocation.
yeah,
Well-
$1,200 short of academic preparation.
So in other words, the vocational students will get the 800 hours of core courses, but they're not going to take history, philosophy, that kind of stuff, right?
Depends. Then that's another mystery. We're gonna know next year how that's gonna be set, because actually states can kind of replicate. You said in the beginning, like in Brazil, students had 13 courses they would take throughout high school. Some states might have just set themselves up for that to happen the same way. They could have. I mean that's not mandatory, but they could have just set that up just the same. Just so they don't go through the trouble of creating a whole new curriculum. So I don't think we're sure.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. All right. Well, it's time to unfortunately end this discussion, but I hope that everybody got something out of it. I learned something about some of these programs, how they're going to work. As you can tell from the discussion, a lot is up in the air in terms of how these students end up, and who's going to. It could be that they actually come out pretty much the same as the academic students, and do become more motivated, and end up doing not only as well in the labor market, but also have options to go on to higher education. So as David said, a lot is in the implementation of how it's implemented, and probably how much they're willing to spend on doing this.
Just as thank you, Martin. So let's thank Martin for his presentation. Not only is he the host of the seminar this quarter, but he's also presenting, which is brave of him. Just as a footnote, it's too bad that our colleague Eduardo Mufareggi is not with us today, because one of the businesses that he is beginning in Brazil is aimed at providing basically post-secondary vocational education to students. So he, as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, sees a failure of the state to provide the kind of vocational training that would actually be useful in the labor market, and sees an opportunity to make some money providing that kind of training. So I'm hoping that he'll speak about that next quarter. So we'll hear from him on this, but it would have been interesting to have him in this discussion.
So next week, João Cosi is going to be our presenter. He's a former student. He now works for the Inter-American Development Bank in Brazil, and you will see. I think he's going to be talking about early childhood education, which is what he worked on when he was a student several years ago. So really looking forward to that, and I hope that get your questions ready on early childhood. for next week because he knows a lot about it and what's going on in Brazil. So thank you very much.